I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. In Ireland, this past weekend, a group of protesters gathered outside the Dáil with the simple message, don't sell us out by forcing us to work abroad. In order to achieve the allegedly falling unemployment numbers, which have to impress the Troika occupiers, the Irish government has been sending letters to the young, unemployed citizens of Ireland suggesting that they leave town, go overseas, scat, scram, pound sand, get out of our statistical sites, skedaddle, beat, get out of here! Troika don't want to see your poor, hungry face in our national accounts no more. Clear out, bogger, because we've traded you for some ghost ships of debt fraud, and the collateral call has come in. So generation emigration, get the frick out of here. Well, you know, we don't want you no more. Stacy, is this true?
Max, we were in Ireland over the weekend, and of course, we did see the representatives of the ghost ship of debt fraud, represented by the Troika, congratulating Ireland for cutting unemployment. Lo and behold, though, you look down below and you see that the young unemployed have been receiving letters from the government suggesting they move overseas, just get out of town.
Well, there's statistics and then there's economics. And unfortunately, the Troika, because they're guided by academic theory and technocrats on the inside, they look at statistics, but they don't look at the actual economy on the ground. They can't see the forest for the trees. They look only at their little screens, and they look at their pie charts, and they look at their algorithmic trading mechanisms, but they don't actually look outside the window and see that people are suffering and that they could benefit from some real economics, which would put some premium on a youth that was having an active participation in the economy, generating organic growth. They don't see that because they're cyborgs, because they're half machine, because they're built in a petri dish somewhere in the ECB. They're not even human, and they're trying to advise people how to conduct an economy. It's disgusting.
Well, it's also a first example you see here of this belief that we don't need humans, we don't need real capital, we don't need real wealth. We just need algo bots and financial derivatives, and that's our economy. We don't need you human beings. We're not leaving assembly to be held in Dublin. So the Young People's Assembly met in Dublin and advocating on behalf of young people to formulate an action plan to combat youth unemployment, forced emigration, and cuts to youth services, which amount eviction notices for a generation. So here's one of their posters, by the way, Max. This is the world they've created for us. Don't let them get away with it. As you see, they left the get out, so I think they need a better education system there, too.
They can't even spell. They can't even spell IMF. Poor kids. But you bring up a good point, which we mentioned on the show before, is that increasingly more people are not needed to make the economy go. Because you just print money. You just print money at the ECB according to some statistical formula, and you get some growth, but the actual requirement for people working is diminishing. Again, just like Saudi Arabia, they don't need workers, they just need to pump oil, a few specialists inside, and the wealth and income gap is just enormous. So you have a totally disenfranchised youth population that's increasingly becoming agitated, and this is happening in Europe now and in the UK and around the world for the same reason. Don't work, we just print money, go to hell.
This is what the youth told them, that they will not be evicted from their own country. And, you know, this brings up the Economics Festival where you spoke, and you had this bizarre situation of these academics and actual central bankers, people who were economists for the Central Bank of Ireland. The same guy also worked for the US Federal Reserve, and he's now a monetary advisor to the European Parliament. And there was a bit of a showdown, you might say. Here's a headline, Max. What's the difference between a comedian and an economist? Kilkenomics is sometimes like a financial panto. Whenever the gleefully villainous U.S. pundit Max Keiser takes the stage, I get an urge to shout, he's behind you! So apparently you had a bit of a showdown with Carl Whelan, an economist for these central banks around the world, who was saying that basically a lot of these economists were suggesting that the problem with Ireland is they need to expand credit. Credit's so cheap right now, why don't they just expand it and their economy will recover? Right,
every single problem to them requires an expansion of debt. And because they're in the business of helping banks create debt. So yeah, we had a big showdown at Kilkenomics. I was on the panel with Liam Halligan, who was a brilliant writer at the Telegraph on the Sunday. I'm always reading his papers, his columns every week. And then suddenly we looked across the column, the dais together, and we kind of communicated like, let's take these suckers down. So it became a bloodbath. and these academics were like on the ground panting. I got Plucky, the rubber chicken, made an appearance. Even he had more to say of credible than the professional economists.
The panel you're discussing, you were talking about statistics being pulled out of the bottom of central bankers. And these guys, including Carl Whelan, was suggesting that they would never lie. They're professionals. They wouldn't lie about statistics. CPI is CPI. Inflation is inflation. We wouldn't lie about that.
Well, the problem, let me just jump in here for a second, because the problem with an academic like a Carl Whelan, a technocrat, is that they keep these guys in silos. They give them a little piece of the puzzle to work on to justify that little piece of the puzzle. They never see the big picture. So someone who's like a professional money manager or somebody who's in the journalism, you see the bigger picture and you see the results of having little siloed men, little men in their silos doing little jobs, coming up with little algorithmic formulas. When they add all that up, it's the banality of evil, isn't it? You end up with kind of a financial totalitarianism generated by little men with their little calculators in silos with no light from the sun.
Well, exactly. Somebody at the Troika was focusing on unemployment numbers in Ireland, and the number looks better and better. Not counting the fact that all the youth, the future possible wealth creators for Ireland, have fled the country, sometimes at the behest of their own government. So this article here about the Kilkenomics Festival points out, humility soon evaporates as everyone vies to demonstrate how wrong other economists are. UCD professor Carl Whelan and Deirdre McCloskey tried discussing the nuances of economic forecasting. Keiser responds by taking a rubber chicken out of a bag. This is not a metaphor. He takes an actual rubber chicken out of a bag. Hey, I'm a government official. My name is Plucky. Do what I say, he says in a high-pitched rubber chicken voice. What's a rubber chicken voice, Max?
Well, I'm not going to speak for Plucky, but Plucky is a better economist than just about anyone at that festival. But it makes an important point in that these economists will typically come on to an Irish stage and tell people that have been abused by debt that debt doesn't matter. This is like Jim Jones saying, drink the Kool-Aid, don't mind the cyanide, because we're going to a better place, Valhalla, where debt doesn't matter. It's on Hale-Bopp Comet. Just drink the cyanide and we'll all go to a better place. They're cultists. They're death cultists. They're dangerous.
Wow. And of course, they do mention, as you're saying, here you have the world of the academics, and then here you have the real world where the young are being told to get the hell out of our country. And they say that audience members shout support for Keiser and lambast poor Whelan. Answer the question. You're wrong, they yell. Because, of course, they see the real world beyond the statistics and the academics saying, oh, just expend credit. It's that simple to fix the situation.
Look, Plucky used to look like Carl Whelan. But after years and years of being wrong, he now looks like Plucky. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's not as if you can just go throughout your entire life by saying bromides and anodyne statements referring to nothing in the hopes of concoctionating something without first understanding that you cannot create truth from that which is pulled from one schwing. Otherwise, you end up like Plucky. Plucky learned his lessons.
Okay. Well, now I want to go back to a headline. This is from 1964, and it's an AP Business News. And at first, somebody linked to it on Zero Hedge, and I thought it was just like an onion piece of 1964. But it appears to be true because there was really a business analyst at the AP called Sam Dawson. High cost of living, not inflation, say economists. The cost of living continues to rise, they were noting, but the government economists assure us that this is not inflation. This can be confusing to Americans who look upon inflation in terms of consumer prices. When the cost of goods and services go up, they call it inflation. Or put it the other way around, when the dollar buys less than last year, to them that's inflation. But government economists are saying, with considerable evidence to back them up, that times are different now, and so are the terms to describe conditions.
Good call, because over the past decades, and really after the whole post-war period, you've got economists writing in mainstream media outlets trying to convince the public that what they see is not true. Don't believe your eyes. Listen to what we have to say on the pages of these editorials describing what the truth is, even though people in their gut and in their heart know that they're being lied to. The difference today is you've got other media outlets, you've got other social media outlets that are confirming what people know in their hearts. They're being fricked up the schwing hard, and they want recourse. They want answers.
Importantly, these were government economists. They were working for the government, and why they were saying that debt is now a really good thing. And sometimes it is, but here they're saying it in a specific situation. They're saying all of this also is tied into the new thinking on federal financing. The federal debt will rise and the annual interest on it, but the general prosperity makes up for it. Remember, this is what we heard all around the world. Alan Greenspan said it. The politicians and bankers here, the same thing in Ireland, the Celtic Tiger. Remember, it was like, sure, our debt is growing astronomically, but so are our house prices. So we're all getting wealthier. Everything's going to be fine.
No, it goes back to what we've been talking about on this show, which is the interest rate apartheid, where you've got one side of the apartheid wall able to speak glowingly of the benefits of having asset price bubbles due to cheap rates that only they can qualify for. And then you have people on the other side of the apartheid wall who are living in a slum, in a ghetto, in the mud, because rates for them are 16, 20, 25%, or in the case of payday loaners, 5,000%. So for them, of course, it looks great, but they refuse to take in to the big picture. So once again, every decade, remember, after World War II, America debt to GDP was enormously high, but they had set the stage for world domination because all their competitors were annihilated and they transformed from a war economy to a manufacturing economy. Today, America's debt is higher than it was after World War II, except what they've done is they've decimated their own economy and enfranchise the rest of the world. It's the reverse of World War II. The Americans decided to say, we don't like the idea of winning a war, let's lose a world war. And that's where they are today. Enormous debt, no manufacturing capacity, and they've emboldened their competitors, and now they're ready to lose what's now the currency war, World War III. It's Plucky's world, we just live in it.
Well, Max, Plucky's with Peter Schiff right outside waiting to come in.
I figured. All right, stay tuned for the second half, a whole lot more.
Does the media lead us or we lead the media? Privacy versus security. All right, your party, where's it going? The questions that no one is asking with the guests that you deserve answers from. It's all on Politicking, only on RT.
Is obviously more for the ladies because it's pink.
If women wanted to avoid rape, they really needed to buy guns and learn how to use them.
Pull down, there's your gun.
This is the one that I want to go with.
Once again, it's the fear factor. Women are definitely a target of the gun lobby.
You don't want to kill them.
We're not wanting to kill anybody, but if somebody, this would hurt them.
What I'm noticing more and more is this really scary marketing tactics, which implies that women have some sort of moral obligation to own guns to protect their families.
Young girls shoot out here too, so we do have a pink one.
More kids, young kids, choke on food than are killed by firearms.
If being armed made us safer in America, we should be the safest nation on Earth. And we're clearly not the safest.
Exactly what happened that day, I don't know. But a woman got killed. A few years later is when I got arrested for it. For a crime I did not do.
We have numerous cases where police officers lie about polygraph results and get innocent people to confess.
And police officers don't beat people anymore. I mean, it just doesn't happen, really, in the course of interrogation. Why? Because there's been this enlightenment? No, because the psychological techniques are more effective in obtaining confessions than physical abuse.
They were off tape. They could do what they wanted, they could say what they wanted, and there was no evidence of what they did or what they said.
The Olympic torch is on its epic journey to Sochi. 123 days through 2,900 towns and cities of Russia, relayed by 14,000 people for 65,000 kilometers in a record-setting trip by land, air, sea, and outer space. Olympic Torch Relay on RT and RT.com.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to author, investment advisor, radio show host, and YouTube superstar, Peter Schiff. Peter Schiff, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thanks for having me on, Max.
All right, fantastic. So, Peter Schiff, of the many right calls you've made very publicly, one of the recent ones was this idea that the Fed would not taper. The idea that the Fed was thinking about cutting back on their monthly quantitative easing from $85 billion a month, but in fact, they did not taper. And so tell us about what's going on there.
Well, I don't think they ever intended to taper. I think they were waiting for the right time to come up with an excuse as to why they weren't going to do it. But they still have to maintain the false pretense that they're going to do it, because what they can't tell the markets is the honest truth, which is that we don't have a genuine recovery. It's phony. It's 100% dependent on quantitative easing. And if they remove those monetary supports, even just a little bit, the whole economy will implode.
Right, and this is, in fact, setting up for possibly Janet Yellen, who's coming in to replace Ben Bernanke. I believe you and others think that they could expand that program from $85 billion a month.
Well, they will expand it. In fact, when the Fed first started talking about tapering, I said, no, the next move is going to be to increase, not diminish QE. That task is going to be left to Janet Yellen. She's going to come up with some reason. Maybe she'll say inflation isn't high enough. We need more inflation. The job picture is still too bleak. But the problem is we're not going to grow the economy. We're not going to create jobs by creating inflation, by debasing our money. It might make the stock market go up. It might make the real estate market go up. And so we can delude ourselves into thinking that we actually are growing the economy, but we're just growing the bubbles and growing the debt. And because the economy will never recover, because the Fed won't let it restructure, right, then the unemployment picture is going to continue to get worse, which means we're going to get more and more QE, and they're going to keep on increasing the dose until we overdose because we have a currency crisis, and then it's over.
The structure of this, it looks like a Ponzi scheme in a lot of ways. In other words,
it is.
Okay, and the Ponzi scheme is that you've got a lot of banks with a lot of bad debts. They're not marked to market, these debts. They're marked to theory or marked to what they say that these bonds are worth. But if you try to sell them on the open market, they would get a lot less than what they say they're worth. So this is like a huge Ponzi scheme. But the U.S. is not the only one involved in this Ponzi scheme, because here at the Bank of England, the new governor, Mark Carney, is speaking from the same playbook. He's saying, you know, we've got to basically keep rates low. They're artificially low. He wants to take bank debts, which are 400% of GDP. He's publicly said he wants to take them to 900% of GDP and take lower rates. The ECB, the European Central Bank, just cut their rate from 0.5% to 0.25%. So is this the same story around the world?
Yeah, it's a Ponzi scheme built on a Ponzi scheme. You know, the thing about Ponzi schemes is they have to keep on growing. And if they don't grow, they implode, because you need bigger supply of new investors to cash out the old investors. I mean, look at the U.S. Treasury bond market. We have a $17 trillion national debt, although, you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We actually have like $100 trillion plus in total debt. The $17 trillion is just where there are Treasury bonds outstanding. But the U.S. government has lots of obligations beyond the Treasury debt. But if you just focus on that, where does the U.S. government get the money to retire all the maturing bonds? Every year, trillions of dollars worth of treasuries mature. The government doesn't have that money. It relies on new buyers to cash out the old buyers. And in many cases, it's the same holders. The people that hold the debt just roll it over so we never have to pay it back. But nobody wants to acknowledge the simple truth that repayment is impossible. All we can do is borrow more money to pay off the maturing debt. But then the debt stack keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger because of the compounding interest and because the government borrows more money every single year.
Right. You mentioned a moment ago about reform. They're delaying reform. They're not reforming. So reform can take two basic avenues here. There's going to be either government reform, reform of government in some way, or reform of banks. Talk a little bit about this idea, because some, I think, are curious about this split, because there's one camp that says just go after the banks, and there's another camp, I think you would be in that camp, saying go after the government.
Well, part of the government is money, and we need monetary reform. And when we have monetary reform, then we'll take care of the banks.
Meaning what, monetary reform?
Well, meaning that money has to be real, it has to be legitimate, and savings have to come into existence based on underconsumption. Right now, where the investment is financed is from a central bank printing money. But that's not legitimate. What you need is to have resources that are not consumed, that are saved, that are then available to finance legitimate capital investment.
Okay, two ideas. Let's say the banks, let's say government, they have two recourses going along those lines. A, they could go to a sound money policies. They could go saying, you know, we're going to go back, we're going to incorporate gold. Maybe not a pure gold standard, but a partial gold standard, but some reference to gold, some reference to hard money. Or B, we're going to take the tools we have in our toolbox now over at the Fed and the monetary policies. We're going to raise rates. We're going to start raising rates to give some value to the dollar. So those would be the two avenues, right, that the government would pursue, that you would look at as restoring some balance to the system, correct?
Yes. And I mean, sure, anything would be an improvement to the pure fiat system we have now. So if we can't go back to a pure 19th century style gold standard, just going back to something that imposes monetary discipline, so you just can't create money out of thin air, so you have a real rate of interest. And then what that will do is a lot of the banks will fail under that scenario because they need this cheap money to prop them up. The whole financial sector will shrink. But what that will do is it will unleash an industrial sector because we're starving Main Street for capital while we're propping up Wall Street. And so if we have legitimate savings and legitimate underconsumption and you have a realistic market price for money, then we're going to have the type of capital investment that actually produces more consumer goods and creates jobs.
Okay, what about this? What about banks who are constantly caught, the big banks, we know the names, they're constantly caught engaged in malfeasance, accounting, fraud, mis-selling. What if instead of just going after civil fines, we started applying penalties, going after them at criminal penalties? If bankers are prosecuted, instead of just saying, well, the government's allowing them to game the system, they're giving them a lot of cheap money, and the government doesn't prosecute them, so they're blameless.
Because again, I don't think the government wants to discourage this activity. They just want their cut. That's all. They want to keep it all going, so they want to slap them on the wrist. When you look at some of the fines that these banks are paying, yes, they're big, but in comparison to all the profits that they made gaming the system, it's very small. So they just have to cut in the government on what they're able to steal based on monetary policy.
It's their business model.
Yeah, they know.
They're only going to be fined $1 for every 10 they steal.
Yeah, so why not do it?
Now, you're in the investment business. I mean, you're a Pacific Capital, very successful business in the United States, and these are your colleagues.
Yeah, well, they're not my colleagues.
They are your colleagues.
Well, I'm not getting in on the action.
No, but I mean, they're giving the industry a bad name a little bit. Don't you feel as though they're the big guys on Wall Street, the J.P. Morgans, the Goldman Sachs, aren't they kind of tainting the business to some?
Absolutely. And you know what they do? They make it more difficult for smaller firms like mine because the SEC and FINRA, they crack down hard on the little firms to show that they're tough cops on the beat. Meanwhile, the real criminals get away with, everything, and all of that regulatory, might comes crashing down on these smaller firms, and they're failing left and right. And of course, that's music to the ears of these gigantic, too big to fail firms because they get to pick up the pieces every time the regulators crush one of their smaller competitors. They're there to absorb, whatever assets they had or hire some of their employees, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Okay, here's another idea. Folks say that all this quantitative easing is not trickling down to inflation, price inflation. Now, there's two answers to this. One is that there actually is price inflation. As you've done a brilliant video on YouTube, you can look it up. It shows that if you actually look at the prices of stuff, really at the cash register, not how the government reports it, inflation in the U.S. is running at 9%, not the 2.25% or 3% that's stated. The other idea I wanted to bring up is, and you touched on this before about employment, because employment and wages are not going up. There's no inflation there. Isn't there an inflation in fraud? In other words, they're printing all this money while simultaneously gaming the system and figuring out ways to channel the money that goes from the banks to the commercial banks, and then it goes right into asset prices, and it bypasses the general economy, the real economy. There's an inflation of fraud. Isn't that a way to look at it in some way?
Well, you can call it, they never trickle down economics. This is trickle down monetary policy, right? If you just print enough money and hand it out to the banks, somehow it's going to trickle down and it's going to benefit everybody else. It just rains inflation on everybody else. I mean, sure, quantitative easing can jack up the stock market, but for average Americans that are just earning a wage, all it does is make those wages less valuable. It destroys their savings. The cost of living goes up. They pay more for food. Their utility bills go up. And you know, the government doesn't acknowledge how much inflation is there. It doesn't acknowledge the effect on prices because of the way the CPI was engineered not to show it. And then the government comes out and says, oh, look, inflation is so low. Here's the CPI. That's the problem. It's not low enough. We need more inflation, as if the problem in America is that the cost of living is not going up fast enough. That the way to solve our economic problems is to make our money less valuable so that people who have money have to spend more of it to survive. How is that an economic policy? You know, I was on CNBC Europe a couple days ago, and one of the announcers said that he thought that inflation not being high enough was going to put stress on the consumer. I mean, stress, it's relief. If prices went down, that would relieve the consumer. What stresses them out is when the prices are going up. And you're right, one of the prices that aren't going up is the price of labor, their wages, because the economy is so screwed up because of all this quantitative easing, because we don't have legitimate savings and investments. We can't have real increasing productivity. People are losing productive, good-paying jobs. They're being replaced by part-time temp jobs in hospitality and leisure and restaurants, and they can barely survive. And the government says, oh, wages are low, therefore we can keep printing money. And all that does is add to the burden of the employed and unemployed, because everything they need gets more expensive. And the other reason that we can't see how bad it is because we've managed to convince the rest of the world to import a lot of our inflation. We export our money and they send us goods, and so prices are kept in check here, but inflation is getting worse all around the world. When the world decides to stop importing our inflation and they let the dollar go down, that's when it's really going to come back and bite us. When the inflation is going to be so enormous that there's going to be no way the government can pretend it doesn't exist.
I wanted to touch on that. We only have about 20 seconds. But unlike the 70s, when wage inflation went up, you had wages go up, and they started an inflationary spiral as it was understood. Since that time, China entered through the World Trade Organization, and cheap labor got exported to China. They also became the world's biggest creditor nation. They've got a whole, $3 to $4 trillion in reserves. When the balance is tipped, and that money, they decide, you know what, it's our risk-reward profile is we're going to put that money back into the economy. Velocity suddenly picks up where it was absent, and then you have that sudden surge in inflation that's been basically nascent or hidden for a few years, and this. Gold goes to 4,000, prices are doubling or tripling, and then people like Paul Krugman will say, well, we never saw it coming. It's a once-in-a-100-year flood and phenomenon. And they
never see it coming. And, the crazy thing is that the problem is bigger now than the housing bubble. Yet the same people who were oblivious to the last problem are equally oblivious to this one, even though in many ways it's even simpler to understand. But they have, they have to build a wall around themselves, cognitive dissonance, to not see the reality. And yeah, when it does happen, who knows what they're going to say? They're probably going to say, "Oh, Peter Schiff, he's a stop clock. He's been saying this for years." So the fact that it finally happened doesn't mean he was right.
Right.
It just
Another
means
Peter Schiff was right video. Another one of these classics. All right, we're out of time. Peter Schiff, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Hey, thanks, Max.
All righty, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Peter Schiff. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.